Sarah Martinez wiped down the same metal counter for the third time that morning, her weathered hands moving in practiced circles. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the Fort Henderson cafeteria, casting harsh shadows across her tired face. At 42, she looked older than her years. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her green uniform hung loose on her small frame. To everyone who passed through those doors, she was just another civilian worker, just another face behind the serving line. But they were wrong about Sarah Martinez. Dead wrong. "Hey, lunch lady," Corporal Jenkins called out as he slammed his tray down on the counter. "Make sure you give me the good stuff today, not that garbage you served yesterday." Sarah looked up with steady brown eyes. She said nothing. She never said much to anyone. Instead, she spooned out the requested portions of mashed potatoes and green beans, her movements precise and controlled. Jenkins grabbed his tray and walked away, laughing with his buddies about something cruel. This was her life now. Day after day, serving meals to young soldiers who saw her as nothing more than hired help. They made jokes about her quiet nature. They called her names behind her back. Some days they said things to her face that would make grown men fight. But Sarah just kept serving food, kept cleaning tables, kept her head down. What they didn't know was that Sarah's hands had once held weapons that could take out targets from over a mile away. Those same hands had defused bombs in Afghanistan. Those same hands had saved more lives than anyone in this cafeteria could imagine. Lieutenant Colonel Davis walked through the serving line around noon, his chest heavy with medals and ribbons. He barely glanced at Sarah as she filled his plate. To him, she was invisible, just part of the furniture. He had no idea that the woman serving his lunch had once carried out missions that were still classified at the highest levels of government. "Extra gravy," he commanded without looking at her. "Yes, sir," Sarah replied quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. As Davis walked away, Sarah's eyes followed him for just a moment. She remembered when officers used to look at her with respect, when they sought her advice before dangerous missions, when her opinion mattered, when she mattered. But that was before everything changed, before the incident that ended her career, before she became a ghost of her former self. The afternoon shift brought more of the same treatment. Sergeant Williams complained loudly about the coffee being too weak. Private First Class Thompson made jokes about how Sarah probably couldn't even do a push-up. The kitchen staff ignored her mostly, treating her like she was slow or simple. If only they knew the truth. Sarah had graduated at the top of her Navy SEAL training class. She was one of only a handful of women to ever complete the grueling program. For 12 years, she had served her country in ways that most people couldn't even imagine. She had jumped out of airplanes into enemy territory. She had swum through freezing waters to reach extraction points. She had looked death in the face more times than she could count. And she had saved lives. So many lives. But now, as she scraped leftover food into garbage bins and loaded industrial dishwashers, nobody remembered Commander Sarah Martinez. Nobody remembered the decorated Navy SEAL who had given everything for her country. They only saw what she had become, a middle-aged woman in a hairnet working for minimum wage at a military base cafeteria. The transformation hadn't been her choice. 3 years ago, everything fell apart during a mission in Syria. Her team had been betrayed by someone they trusted. Good soldiers died because of bad intelligence. Sarah had been blamed for decisions that weren't hers to make. The military needed a scapegoat, and she became it. The official report said she had made tactical errors. It said she had compromised the mission. It said she was unfit for command. None of it was true, but the truth didn't matter. Her security clearance was revoked. Her commission was terminated. Her life as she knew it was over. The worst part wasn't losing her career. The worst part was losing her identity. For 12 years, she had been someone who mattered. Someone whose skills and experience made a difference. Now she was nobody. Just another face in the crowd, serving lunch to people who would never know what she had sacrificed for them. But Sarah had learned to live with the pain. She had learned to swallow her pride every day and do whatever job would pay the bills. When the position at Fort Henderson opened up, she took it without hesitation. It wasn't much, but it kept her close to the military world she still loved, even if that world no longer loved her back. Some days were harder than others. Like today, when she overheard 2 young privates making fun of her appearance. They wondered out loud how someone so pathetic had even gotten hired. They laughed about how she probably lived alone with a dozen cats. They joked that she had probably never been on a date in her life. Sarah kept washing dishes, her jaw clenched tight. These kids had no idea what real pathetic looked like. They had never seen their friends die in foreign deserts. They had never had to make split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death for innocent people. They had never carried the weight of responsibility that comes with protecting freedom. But she couldn't tell them any of that, so she just kept working, counting the hours until she could go home to her small apartment and try to forget who she used to be. As the evening shift began, Sarah noticed something different about the base. There was unusual activity near the main entrance. Security guards were checking IDs more carefully than normal. Radio chatter seemed more intense. Something was happening, but nobody told the cafeteria staff anything important. Sarah's instincts, dulled by 3 years of routine work, began to sharpen. Something felt wrong, very wrong, and then the lights went out. Emergency lighting flickered on, casting eerie red shadows across the cafeteria. Sarah's body went rigid, every muscle tensing with years of combat training. The familiar surge of adrenaline flooded her system. This wasn't a power outage. This was something else entirely. Gunshots echoed from somewhere outside the building. Sharp, rapid bursts that Sarah recognized immediately as automatic weapons fire. Not American weapons. Foreign assault rifles. Around her, chaos erupted. Kitchen staff screamed and dove for cover behind metal counters. A young cook named Tommy started hyperventilating in the corner. The evening shift soldiers who had been eating dinner jumped to their feet, confused and panicked. "What's happening?" Private Morrison shouted, his voice cracking with fear. "Probably just a drill," Sergeant Williams said, trying to sound calm but failing miserably. "You know how they love their surprise exercises." Sarah knew better. This was no drill. More gunshots rang out, closer this time. Through the cafeteria windows, Sarah could see muzzle flashes in the darkness. Armed figures moved between buildings, their movements coordinated and professional. These weren't random attackers. This was a planned assault. "Everyone needs to get down," Sarah said firmly, her voice cutting through the panic. Sergeant Williams spun around, his face red with anger. "Who asked you, lunch lady? We don't need advice from some civilian worker." Sarah's jaw tightened, but she didn't argue. Instead, she moved toward the windows, staying low and using the serving counters for cover. Her trained eyes scanned the compound, counting attackers and noting their positions. Old habits kicked in automatically. She counted at least 8 hostiles, possibly more. They were dressed in black tactical gear and moved with military precision. This wasn't some random terrorist cell. These were professionals. 6 tangos approaching from the north, she whispered to herself, using military terminology that felt natural after years of combat. "What did you say?" Private Morrison asked, crawling over to where Sarah crouched. "Nothing," Sarah replied, still watching the attackers advance. An explosion rocked the building, shattering several windows. Glass rained down on the dining area as everyone screamed and covered their heads. The lights went out completely now, leaving only the dim red emergency illumination. "They're coming for the command center," Sarah realized out loud. Fort Henderson housed a critical intelligence facility. The attackers weren't here to cause random destruction. They had a specific target. They wanted something from the base computers, or they wanted to destroy something important. Either way, they had planned this attack carefully. Another explosion, closer this time. Sarah could hear boots running across the courtyard outside. Radio chatter from the surviving guards was frantic and disorganized. The base was completely unprepared for this level of assault. "We need to barricade the doors," Sarah said, standing up despite the danger. "Sit down," Williams barked. "You're going to get yourself killed." But Sarah was already moving. She grabbed heavy tables and began dragging them toward the main entrance. Her movements were swift and efficient, positioning the furniture to create the best defensive position possible. "Help me," she called to the others. Most of them just stared at her like she had lost her mind. A 42-year-old cafeteria worker trying to set up military defenses. It seemed absurd to them. Only young Private Morrison and Tommy the cook jumped up to help. They followed Sarah's instructions without question, moving tables and chairs into strategic positions. "Now the kitchen entrance," Sarah directed, pointing toward the back of the building. Williams finally stood up, his face twisted with frustration. "This is ridiculous. We should be trying to evacuate, not turning this place into some kind of fortress." "Where exactly do you plan to evacuate to?" Sarah asked calmly, nodding toward the windows where muzzle flashes continued to light up the darkness. They have the whole compound surrounded. Williams had no answer for that. More gunfire erupted outside, followed by screams. The attackers were systematically taking control of the base, building by building. Sarah recognized their tactics immediately. These weren't amateurs. Through her years of combat experience, Sarah knew they had maybe 10 minutes before the hostiles reached the cafeteria. 10 minutes to prepare for what was coming. Everyone who knows how to fight, gather any weapons you can find, she ordered, her natural command authority taking over despite her civilian status. Listen here, lunch lady, Williams snarled, stepping toward her aggressively. I'm the ranking non-commissioned officer in this room. I give the orders here, not some washed-up cafeteria worker. Sarah looked at him with steady eyes. For just a moment, the mask slipped. Williams saw something in her gaze that made him take a step back. Something cold and professional and very, very dangerous. Fine, Sarah said quietly. What are your orders, Sergeant? Williams opened his mouth, then closed it again. He had no idea what to do. His training covered basic combat situations, but nothing like this. He was a supply clerk, not a warrior. He stammered. We should establish defensive positions and prepare for contact, Sarah finished for him, which is what I was doing. She turned away from Williams and continued organizing their makeshift defenses. Morrison and Tommy kept following her lead, along with a few other young soldiers who recognized competence when they saw it. From the kitchen, Sarah gathered every knife that could serve as a weapon. She found a fire extinguisher and positioned it strategically near the main entrance. She located the building's fire alarm system and disabled it, so their position wouldn't be compromised by noise. All of this took less than 5 minutes. Her movements were practiced and sure, like she had done this 100 times before, because she had. How do you know all this stuff? Morrison whispered as they crouched behind their improvised barricade. Sarah glanced at him. Such a young face. He couldn't be more than 19 years old. Just a kid who had probably signed up for college money and steady work, never imagining he would face real combat. I watch a lot of action movies, she said, but Morrison wasn't buying it. Neither was Tommy. They could see something in Sarah's demeanor that didn't match her cafeteria worker cover story. The way she moved, the way she assessed threats, the way she naturally took command despite everyone treating her like she was nobody important. Another explosion shook the building. This time the lights went out completely. Emergency backup power kicked in, but even that was dim and unreliable. Through the darkness, Sarah could hear voices outside. Foreign accents. Commands being given in what sounded like Russian or Eastern European. Her blood ran cold. She recognized that language from missions she couldn't talk about. Missions that were still classified. These weren't just any terrorists. These were professionals from organizations she had fought before. And they were about to discover that their carefully planned assault had one variable they hadn't counted on. Sarah Martinez was ready for war. The sound of boots approached the cafeteria entrance. The footsteps outside grew louder, heavy boots on concrete, moving with purpose toward the cafeteria entrance. Sarah pressed herself against the wall next to the barricaded door, her body automatically falling into a combat stance she hadn't used in 3 years. Everyone stay quiet, she whispered, her voice carrying an authority that made even Sergeant Williams obey without question. Through the small window in the door, Sarah could see flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. 3 figures approached, their weapons raised and ready. Professional, disciplined, deadly. The first attacker reached the door and tried the handle. Finding it locked, he stepped back and signaled to his companions. One of them produced what looked like a small explosive device. Sarah's mind raced. Breach charge. They would blow the door in seconds, then storm the room with overwhelming firepower. Everyone hiding behind tables and counters would be sitting ducks. But Sarah had been in this situation before. Many times. When that door blows, everyone stay down, she instructed quietly. Don't move until I tell you. What are you going to do? Morrison whispered, his young voice shaking with fear. Sarah didn't answer. Instead, she picked up one of the large kitchen knives and moved silently toward the side wall, positioning herself where the attackers wouldn't see her immediately when they entered. Williams watched her movements with growing confusion. There was something different about the way Sarah moved now. Something that didn't match her identity as a simple cafeteria worker. Her steps were silent, calculated. Her body language had shifted from submissive to predatory. The explosive charge detonated with a thunderous blast. The door shattered inward, sending chunks of wood and metal flying across the room. Smoke and dust filled the air as the three attackers charged through the opening. They expected to find terrified civilians cowering behind furniture. Instead, they found something else entirely. Sarah moved like a shadow. The first attacker through the door never saw her coming. She struck from his blind spot, the kitchen knife finding its mark with surgical precision. He dropped without making a sound. The second attacker spun toward the movement, raising his assault rifle. But Sarah was already moving again, using the first man's falling body as cover. She rolled behind the serving counter as automatic gunfire erupted, bullets sparking off metal surfaces. Contact left. The remaining attackers shouted in accented English. Sarah's mind cataloged everything in an instant. 2 hostiles remaining in the room, both armed with AK pattern rifles, one positioned near the entrance, the other moving to flank her position. Standard room clearing tactics. But Sarah knew those tactics better than they did. She grabbed the fire extinguisher she had positioned earlier and pulled the pin. White chemical foam sprayed across the room, creating a dense cloud that obscured vision. In the confusion, she moved again. The flanking attacker emerged from the smoke, his rifle sweeping back and forth as he searched for targets. He found Sarah's knife instead, thrown with deadly accuracy from 15 feet away. The third attacker realized something was very wrong. This wasn't supposed to happen. Intelligence reports said the cafeteria would be full of helpless civilians and maybe 1 or 2 untrained soldiers. Nobody had mentioned anything about resistance from someone with obvious combat skills. He spoke rapidly into his radio, calling for backup. Sarah caught enough words to understand the meaning. More hostiles were coming, probably a lot more. "Is everyone okay?" Sarah called out, her voice steady despite the violence that had just occurred. Morrison poked his head up from behind an overturned table. His eyes were wide with shock. What just happened?" Sergeant Williams stood up slowly, staring at Sarah like he was seeing her for the first time. The woman who had been serving him lunch for 2 years had just taken out 3 armed terrorists with the efficiency of a trained killer. "Who are you?" he asked quietly. Sarah ignored the question. She was already moving to the weapons dropped by the attackers, checking ammunition levels and condition. The familiar weight of an assault rifle felt strange in her hands after 3 years. But muscle memory took over immediately. "We need to move," she said, slinging one rifle over her shoulder and keeping the other ready. "More will be coming. Move where?" Tommy asked, his face pale with shock. Sarah moved to the window and peered out carefully. The situation outside had worsened. She could see at least a dozen more attackers moving through the compound. They had taken control of most of the base's key buildings and were systematically hunting down any remaining resistance. But Sarah's trained eye also noticed something else. The attackers were being sloppy now, overconfident. They thought they had already won. "The command center," Sarah said, pointing toward a heavily fortified building across the courtyard. "That's what they're really after. Everything else is just distraction." "How do you know that?" Williams demanded. Sarah looked at him for a long moment. These people deserved to know who they were dealing with, especially if they were going to follow her into what came next. "Because I've been on missions like this before," she said simply, from the other side. The room fell silent except for the distant sound of gunfire and explosions. Everyone stared at Sarah, trying to process what she had just revealed. Morrison was the first to speak. "You're military." "Was," Sarah corrected. "Navy Special Operations." Williams' jaw dropped. "You're telling me you're some kind of Navy SEAL?" Sarah didn't answer directly. Instead, she checked her weapon again and moved toward the broken door. "Right now, I'm someone who knows how to keep you alive. That's all that matters." Through her radio communications training, Sarah had been listening to the scattered chatter from the base's remaining defenders. Most of the regular security forces had been overwhelmed in the initial assault. The few survivors were trapped in various buildings with no coordination and no leadership. But Sarah also heard something else in the radio traffic. The attackers were speaking in code, but she recognized the language patterns. These weren't just any foreign operatives. They were from an organization she had encountered before, during classified missions she couldn't discuss even now. They were here for more than just intelligence. They were here for revenge. "Listen to me carefully," Sarah said, turning to face the group of survivors. "These aren't random terrorists. They're professionals with a specific mission. They won't stop until they get what they came for, or until someone stops them. And you think you can stop them? Williams asked, his voice mixture of hope and disbelief. Sarah hefted the assault rifle and checked the tactical vest she had taken from one of the dead attackers. It fit perfectly, like she had been wearing such equipment her whole life. I'm going to try, she said. Outside, vehicle engines roared to life. Through the window, Sarah could see military trucks approaching the command center. The attackers were making their final push. Stay here, Sarah ordered. Barricade this room again after I leave. Don't come out until you hear all clear signals from legitimate base personnel. Where are you going? Morrison asked. Sarah moved toward the door, her transformation from cafeteria worker to combat operative now complete. The scared, quiet woman who had served their meals was gone. In her place stood someone who moved with deadly purpose. To finish what they started, she said. As Sarah prepared to leave, Williams grabbed her arm. Wait, what's your real name? Your rank? Sarah looked back at him one last time. For 3 years she had been nobody, just another face in the crowd, forgotten and dismissed by the same military she had served with distinction. Commander Sarah Martinez, she said quietly. Navy SEALs. Team 6, the room went dead silent. Even in their panic, everyone recognized that designation. Team 6 was legendary, the most elite special operations unit in the world. Sarah Martinez wasn't just a former SEAL. She was one of the best warriors the military had ever produced. And now she was going to war. Sarah slipped out of the cafeteria into the chaos of the night. The familiar weight of combat gear felt like coming home after a long exile. Every sense was heightened, every movement calculated. For the first time in 3 years, she was exactly where she belonged. The compound was a battlefield. Emergency lights cast long shadows between buildings as smoke drifted across the courtyard. Sarah moved like a ghost, using cover and concealment techniques that had kept her alive in a dozen war zones. She reached the first checkpoint and found 2 base security guards pinned down behind a concrete barrier. Automatic weapons fire kept them trapped while attackers moved to flank their position. Sarah circled wide, approaching the hostile position from their blind spot. 2 quick silent takedowns later, the immediate threat was eliminated. The guards looked up in shock as Sarah appeared beside them. Commander Martinez, Navy SEALs, she identified herself quickly. What's your situation report? The senior guard, a staff sergeant named Roberts, stared at her in disbelief. Ma'am, we thought you were... aren't you the cafeteria? Later, Sarah cut him off. Right now I need intel. How many hostiles? What's their objective? Robert struggled to process what was happening, but training kicked in. At least 20 attackers, ma'am. Maybe more. They hit us fast and hard, took out communications first. Most of our people are dead or scattered. Sarah nodded grimly. Command center status? Still secure, but they're moving heavy equipment toward it. Looks like they're planning to breach the main vault. Sarah's blood ran cold. The vault at Fort Henderson contained more than just intelligence files. It held classified records from dozens of special operations missions, including the one that had destroyed her career. If these attackers got access to those files, they could expose American agents and operations around the world. But there was something else. Something personal. Sergeant, do you have radio contact with anyone in the command center? Sarah asked. Negative, ma'am. They went dark 20 minutes ago. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, calculating odds and options. 20 hostile operatives, probably more. Unknown casualties among base personnel. No backup coming because this attack had been planned to look like an internal security drill until it was too late. Against all of that, she had herself, 2 security guards, and whatever weapons they could scavenge. She had faced worse odds before. Here's what we're going to do, Sarah said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had led men into combat. You 2 are going to create a distraction at the motor pool. Make noise, fire some shots, get their attention. I need 15 minutes to reach the command center. What about you, ma'am? Roberts asked. Sarah checked her weapon one more time. I'm going to end this. She moved through the compound like a predator stalking prey. 3 years of serving lunch hadn't dulled her instincts one bit. If anything, the anger and frustration of being dismissed and forgotten had sharpened her edge. Sarah eliminated 2 more sentries before reaching the command center perimeter. Through the darkness, she could see the main assault team preparing their final push. They had shaped charges positioned to blow through the vault door. Sophisticated equipment that spoke to careful planning and significant resources. But as Sarah got closer, she saw something that made her heart stop. The man directing the assault was someone she recognized. Colonel Viktor Petrov, formerly of Russian Special Forces. The same man who had been her opposite number during the Syrian mission 3 years ago. The same man whose operation she had disrupted, saving dozens of innocent lives but earning his eternal hatred. The same man whose false intelligence had led to the mission failure that ended her career. Everything clicked into place. The attack on Fort Henderson wasn't random. Petrov had spent 3 years tracking her down, learning about her disgrace, planning his revenge. He wanted the classified files from the vault, but he also wanted to destroy the woman who had humiliated him in Syria. Sarah's jaw tightened. Personal or not, Petrov had made a fatal mistake. He had brought a fight to her doorstep, threatened innocent Americans, and assumed she was no longer a threat. He was about to learn how wrong he was. Sarah began her assault just as the diversionary explosion erupted at the motor pool. Half of Petrov's men immediately moved to investigate, leaving only 8 to guard the command center. 8 against 1. Sarah had faced worse odds on a Tuesday morning in Afghanistan. The first 2 never knew what hit them. Sarah's silenced sidearm, taken from a fallen attacker, made quick work of the outer perimeter guards. She moved to the next position, using shadows and terrain like an old friend. The 3rd and 4th hostiles were positioned near the main entrance. Sarah approached from above, having scaled the building's exterior with the climbing skills that had made her legendary in the SEAL community. 2 more silent takedowns. Petrov was so focused on his vault assault that he didn't notice his perimeter collapsing. Sarah had always been better at this than him, and 3 years of anger had only made her more focused. The remaining 4 operatives were clustered around the shaped charges, preparing for the final breach. Sarah could have taken them all with the assault rifle, but she wanted this to be personal. She wanted Petrov to see her coming. "Colonel Viktor Petrov," she called out, stepping into the light with her weapon raised. Petrov spun around, his face going white with shock. "Impossible. You are nobody now. Disgraced, forgotten." "Funny thing about being nobody," Sarah said, keeping her rifle trained on his center mass. "Nobody expects you to show up when it matters." Petrov's remaining men tried to bring their weapons around, but Sarah was already moving. Years of elite training and combat experience against 4 surprised operatives was hardly a fair fight. For them. When the shooting stopped, Sarah stood over Petrov's wounded form. He was alive, but barely. Around him, his carefully planned operation lay in ruins. "The Syrian mission," Sarah said quietly. "You fed false intelligence to my contact. You wanted my team to walk into that ambush." Petrov coughed up blood but managed a bitter smile. "You cost me everything. My operation, my career. I wanted you to know what that felt like." "You killed good soldiers with your lies," Sarah replied. "And then you let me take the blame." Sirens wailed in the distance. Real backup was finally arriving, alerted by the explosions and gunfire. Sarah's radio crackled to life with the voices of legitimate base personnel. As military police and emergency responders flooded the compound, Sarah found herself surrounded by people who had spent 3 years treating her like she was invisible. Now they stared at her with expressions of awe, confusion, and dawning respect. Lieutenant Colonel Davis was among the first to reach the command center. He took in the scene, multiple dead terrorists, a wounded Russian operative, and Sarah Martinez standing calmly in the middle of it all with an assault rifle in her hands. "Commander Martinez," he said quietly, using her proper rank for the first time since she had started working in the cafeteria. "We owe you an explanation, and an apology." Over the next several hours, as investigators pieced together what had happened, the truth finally came to light. Petrov's confession, combined with evidence found on his body and in his communications, proved that Sarah had been set up 3 years ago. The Syrian mission failure wasn't her fault. She had been a scapegoat for a Russian intelligence operation. Sergeant Williams found Sarah sitting alone outside the cafeteria as dawn broke over Fort Henderson. She looked exhausted but peaceful, like a weight had finally been lifted from her shoulders. "Commander," he said quietly, "I wanted to apologize for how we treated you. We didn't know." Sarah looked up at him. "You treated me exactly like what I appeared to be. I don't blame you for that. But you're a hero. You saved all our lives tonight." Sarah stood up, brushing dust off her uniform. "I'm just someone who did her job. Same as always." 6 months later, Commander Sarah Martinez stood in dress blues as the Secretary of the Navy pinned a new medal to her chest. Her security clearance had been fully restored. Her record had been cleared. She had been offered any assignment she wanted, but Sarah had made a different choice. She requested to return to Fort Henderson. Not to the cafeteria, but as the new head of base security. She wanted to train the next generation of soldiers, to teach them what real readiness looked like. On her first day in her new position, Sarah walked through the cafeteria where she had spent 3 years being invisible. The staff who had once ignored her now stood at attention as she passed, but Sarah stopped at the serving line and picked up a ladle. "Mind if I help serve lunch today?" She asked the kitchen supervisor with a smile, because Sarah Martinez had learned something important during her time behind that counter. It didn't matter what job you did or how others saw you. What mattered was being ready when your moment came, and when that moment arrived, she had been exactly who she needed to be, a United States Navy SEAL. The cafeteria worker nobody knew was a hero until the day she saved them all,